Mississippi, as the heart of the Deep South, holds the remnants of the agricultural and river industry glory that once dominated the American economy in the 19th century. But as river currents shifted and trade routes moved onto asphalt, the towns that were once prosperous slowly lost their reason to survive. Behind the hanging Spanish moss and the vast cotton fields of the Delta region, there are traces of settlements that have officially become ghost towns or are now standing on the edge of extinction. Yes, the depopulation phenomenon here is not just a matter of statistics, but a narrative about dependence on a single resource and the failure of infrastructure to keep up with changing times. These are 15 towns in Mississippi that have become memories, along with those now counting down their final days toward total silence. We have to begin with Rodney in Jefferson County, the most legendary and at the same time most tragic ghost town in Mississippi. In the mid-1800s, Rodney nearly became the state capital because of its position as an extremely busy river port where steamboats docked every hour to carry cotton. But the fate of this town changed drastically when the Mississippi River naturally shifted its course away from the town's dock after a major flood. Without water access, which had been its lifeblood, Rodney's economy stopped almost instantly, and its people left behind their grand buildings. Today, Rodney is a silent, open-air museum where the only sound is the scraping of tree branches against old walls. Its most iconic object is the red brick Presbyterian church, which still bears cannonball marks from the Civil War era, a symbol of endurance now surrounded by swamp and dense forest. Rodney was destroyed by the unpredictable movement of water, but for Rocky Springs, the death of the town came from a combination of pest attacks and systematic soil failure. Located along the historic Natchez Trace, Rocky Springs was once a thriving settlement with a population of more than 2,000 people who lived from its abundant land. Its prosperity was built on cotton, but its collapse began when boll weevils destroyed the entire farmland in a short time. Combined with severe soil erosion caused by deforestation and deadly yellow fever outbreaks, the people of Rocky Springs began a massive exodus. Today, the site is managed by the National Park Service as a reminder of how fragile a civilization can be. All that remains is the 1837 Methodist Church still standing firmly on the hill, surrounded by an old bank vault frozen in the middle of the forest, along with rows of old gravestones now completely covered in green moss. If Rocky Springs slowly faded because of natural forces, this town instead met its end in a single night. Yes, Bankston in Choctaw County is a dark monument to industrial destruction caused by armed conflict that crushed the dream of progress. In the mid-19th century, Bankston became a highly advanced textile industry center in Mississippi, employing hundreds of people in modern factories that produced cloth and shoes for the Army. Because of that strategic role, the Union Army launched a scorched earth attack and burned the entire town along with its factories in 1864. Unlike many other towns, Bankston never had the chance to be rebuilt from its ashes. Now, the site has been completely swallowed by wild vegetation, leaving behind only a few pieces of brick foundation buried beneath the ground. War violence was also one of the causes behind the fall of Grand Gulf, although the brutality of the river's flow remained the main force that swept its future into the water below. Once a port town busier and more promising than Vicksburg, Grand Gulf in Claiborne County suffered a double misfortune that could not be avoided. First, the powerful current of the Mississippi River began to erode the town's edge aggressively, quite literally dragging many buildings and commercial warehouses into the riverbed. Second, The town was devastated by intense artillery fighting during the military campaign in the area, leaving very few structures that could still be lived in. Every attempt by the remaining residents to rebuild was repeatedly undone by major floods, as if the river wanted to reclaim its land. Today, Grand Gulf has become a quiet historic park. Visitors can only see the remains of an old cemetery and the ruins of buildings leaning at dramatic angles, offering a clear picture of how fragile human settlement can be in the face of nature's power. From the ruins of a sunken port town, we move to a monument of failed grandeur that has become one of the strongest visual symbols of destruction in the Deep South. Although technically not a full town, Windsor Ruins is the clearest representation of fallen splendor and the cost of carelessness. Yes, this is what remains of Windsor Mansion, the largest and most magnificent residence in the state, built from the wealth of slave-grown cotton before the Civil War. After surviving the horrors of war with little damage, this grand house was instead destroyed by fire in 1890 simply because of the careless cigarette of a guest during a party. All that remains are 23 giant Corinthian columns standing 45 feet tall, rising from the quiet grassland as if they were enormous fingers pointing toward the sky. In contrast to the earlier towns, Shubuta appears with a different face, yet it seems to be transforming into a ghost town right before our eyes, creating a sad scene for travelers passing through. Once a vital center of timber trade and agriculture, Shubuta is now better known for its dark history, tied to the old swinging bridge that became a silent witness to past injustice. Visually, downtown Shubuta presents a row of cracked brick buildings with windows boarded up with wood, as if trying to hide the emptiness inside. The town's population keeps shrinking with each passing decade because there is no new industry strong enough to support local life. Walking along its main street gives off a deeply melancholic feeling, where the grand buildings from the early 20th century now seem to be waiting for the moment they finally collapse and disappear into the embrace of overgrown brush. Another dying town brings us to Stonewall, a place whose life and death were determined by a single factory. Stonewall is the prototype of a mill town that lost its heart and is now gasping for its final breath. Its name was taken from a Confederate historical figure, and for more than a century, the large textile mill here was the only reason the town kept beating. But when that factory finally gave in to global competition and closed in 2002, Stonewall seemed to lose its soul and purpose overnight. Hundreds of worker houses built in the same style now sit empty, with wild grass growing as high as the doors, while the massive mill complex in the center of town now resembles a giant rusting skeleton consumed by age. Stonewall is in the final stage of its existence. Without radical economic transformation, this town will slowly turn into a wide and uninhabited ghost settlement. Not far from there, Quitman is also facing a similar threat of depopulation, though on a slightly broader and sadder scale. As the county seat of Clark County, Quitman should have been a stable center of activity and a support point for the surrounding area. But the reality on the ground shows signs of economic exhaustion that are becoming harder to hide. The mass closure of timber industries and local manufacturing has triggered constant depopulation, forcing younger people to seek opportunity outside the state. Downtown Quitman today is filled with empty commercial buildings and for sale signs whose colors have faded under the Mississippi sun. The town's large infrastructure and wide streets now feel excessive for a population that keeps shrinking. The silence in Quitman feels even more real when we move to Lorman, a tiny point on a historic route that survives only because of the existence of a single store. Lorman in Jefferson County can barely still be called a functioning town in the modern sense. It feels more like a collection of memories left behind along the roadside. This settlement is now only a scattered group of old wooden buildings spread unevenly along the legendary Highway 61 route. The only reason the name Lorman is still mentioned and visited so often is the presence of the Old Country Store, which serves legendary fried chicken to tourists. Outside the area around that store, the remaining signs of life in Lorman look deeply worrying. Many wooden houses can be seen with collapsed roofs, along with an old gas station covered in thick rust. Lorman represents the tragic fate of many small settlements in Mississippi that are slowly being erased from the map as more residents move toward larger satellite towns. If Lorman is a victim of changing shopping patterns and mobility, then Tchula is a victim of the most extreme systemic poverty on the American mainland. Tchula regularly appears on lists of the poorest towns in the United States, and every corner of the town seems to confirm those painful statistics. Located right in the heart of the Fertile Delta region, Tchula instead faces a severe population crisis because none of that natural wealth seems to reach its residents. The buildings in its downtown look like the remains of a post-disaster ruin, collapsing brick walls, paint completely peeling away to expose the wooden frame underneath, and roads filled with deep potholes. Depopulation in Tchula is driven by economic hopelessness that leaves no room for younger generations to build a future there. This is a town in a state of emergency. If this decline is not stopped, Tchula could eventually follow Rodney into becoming a ghost town in the coming decades, with an especially bitter story of poverty behind it. A similar depopulation crisis also haunts Mound Bayou, a town with extremely high historical value. Yes, it has a remarkably unique history. It was founded by formerly enslaved people as a self-sustaining town that became a symbol of resistance and Black economic independence during the era of Jim Crow discrimination. But great history and pride in the past have not been strong enough to hold back the tide of depopulation driven by basic economic needs. Today, Mound Bayou is struggling against rapidly aging infrastructure and the loss of many key businesses that once supported its residents. Many historic buildings here, including the first hospital for Black residents in Mississippi, are now in very worrying physical condition because of limited maintenance funds. Mound Bayou is racing against time to save its identity and heritage before its entire working-age population leaves the town in search of opportunities elsewhere. Next is Glendora, a town marked by historical trauma. Located in the remote area of Tallahatchie County, Glendora is a quiet place with an atmosphere that seems to carry sadness from its dark past. Here stand the remains of a grocery store closely tied to the Emmett Till case, a tragedy that helped spark the civil rights movement across America. But beyond that rarely visited historical tourism, Glendora looks like a settlement already halfway to death. Many of the small wooden houses along its main road are leaning, surrounded by wild vines covering the windows. With a population now only around the low hundreds, Glendora is standing on the edge of total extinction. This town reflects the fate of many small villages in the Mississippi Delta that are slowly disappearing from memory because modern agricultural mechanization no longer needs human labor. Agricultural mechanization and the loss of traditional jobs have also changed the face of Clarksdale. a legendary town that now has a darker side few people see. Yes, Clarksdale is known around the world as a holy ground for blues music, but if you step outside the bright Ground Zero tourist area, you will find a surprising reality. Many blocks on the edges of downtown Clarksdale are now filled with grand brick buildings that stand empty, with no residents and no business activity left inside. The sharp contrast between lively music tourism and the physical reality of the abandoned buildings around it creates the feeling of a ghost town within a town. Clarksdale is fighting hard against high crime and poverty, two major factors driving middle-class residents and business owners to leave. From a struggling blues center, we move to the riverbank to look at Friars Point. Once praised with admiration by Mark Twain in his travel writings, Friars Point used to be a very dynamic river port full of energy. But when railroad routes began taking over the role of river transport and massive levee systems were built, Friars Point seemed to become cut off from the outside world and left behind by the current of progress. Today, the atmosphere there is so quiet, it feels as if the town is holding its own breath. Old buildings near the river levee appear cracked, with doors tightly shut, showing that the town has lost almost all of its function as a trading center. Friars Point represents the tragic fate of Mississippi River towns that have now become forgotten outlying settlements, where time seems to have truly stopped turning decades ago. Finally, we close this list in Port Gibson, a town whose beauty has become a burden for its residents during the crisis surrounding it. Port Gibson was called a town too beautiful to burn by General Grant when he saw the magnificence of its architecture during the Civil War. But the beauty of that antebellum architecture, which survived the flames of war, is now threatened by a slow collapse caused by the lack of funds for maintenance, restoration. Port Gibson is facing a steady and worrying population decline, which directly affects the shrinking tax base needed to preserve its historic sites. Many grand homes with their iconic white columns now look weathered, with moss slowly creeping up their cracked walls. Port Gibson is the face of a graceful decline, a town trying hard to preserve the dignity of its past, while modern economic reality grows narrower with each passing day.